Thanks for listening to the Healthy Church Podcast with Larry Barker and Drew Klein.
Hey everybody, thank you for joining us on the Healthy Church Podcast. My name is Drew Klein, here with Larry Barker. And Larry, we have a very special guest today. I'm excited about this conversation. You know, this is a passion for both of us, and I think maybe even more so for this guest. So why don't you do the introductions for us?
Well, we are excited today, and I do want to mention again that there's a hairstyle going on with this podcast, or maybe I should say the lack thereof. But anyway, right. And we did have Heidi, who you've met before, Steve, on the first podcast. So there was one good hairdo in the other podcast that we did. But Steve, I'm with Drew. We're just so excited. You know, I'll even prep it this way. I was driving. I don't want anybody to think I'm being negative about what happened on Easter Sunday. But as I drove around our town, and we were double what we normally have, and everybody gets all excited. But then as I drove around town, because our service is a little earlier, every parking lot was full. It's kind of like it's a cultural thing, isn't it? We, as Americans, so many more are going to show up on Easter than just about any other day. And we're all for that. We're not against that. But I as I drove around, Steve, I just kind of had to be saddened a little. What are we going to do with it? You know, how are we going to approach it? It's not how many you have. It's what are you doing with those who God has given you? And that's why I think today it's perfect to have you on here because I've seen you draw the circles many times, the large circle, the middle circle, and then your discipleship materials is referred to as small circle. So this is Steve McCoy, pastors in Sarasota, Florida, who we met through a great friend, Charlie Costa, whose brother, is he still at your church, Steve?
They've actually moved to Jacksonville, but every time they're in town, and we're very close to Charlie's brother, and we actually, my wife and I taught their kids piano, believe it or not, for a number of years.
Yeah. I thought I had heard that they had moved, and I wasn't sure, but I remember several years ago at one of our, we have an annual meeting for our tribe of churches, and I was invited to meet you, and it was through that connection with Charlie to make us aware of these materials. So I'm just going to kick it off and say, why small circles, Steve?
Well, thank you, Larry and Drew. Thanks for having me today. And let me just return the gratitude for BMA. It's been a wonderful relationship and partnership. We've walked through the door together to the Middle East. A significant impact is being made there, and that all started in the partnership with BMA. Also, Western Europe and Portugal. So. And Romania and Eastern Europe. So thank you.
Hold it right there, because I just handed the materials to the guys in Romania about 6 weeks ago, and man, their eyes lit up because they have the materials in their language.
Yes, well, that is. Thank you for saying that. Sorry, my phone is never rings is ringing. Yeah, so let me just begin by saying about Small Circle that it is. It is often overlooked in our church culture, unfortunately, because I think for many years we've been conditioned to think in terms of groups. And having said that, we have many groups in our church. So this is not anti-Easter, anti-worship service, anti-group ministry, anti-Bible study, but I think that it comes down to the expectation of what each of those can do. I often say, hey, a screwdriver can do a lot of things, but I wouldn't flip a pancake with it. And so in the same regard, I think it takes actually pressure off of leaders and pastors and churches when we begin to really take an honest look at, especially from the relational set of lenses, what can we expect on a Sunday morning in terms of relationships? What can we expect from a typical group setting when it comes to relationships? And as we're going to talk about, God created us for a deeper level of relationship. So let's begin there. So when we go back to the creation story and the events that took place at the creation, and of course the crowning moment was when God created Adam and he breathed life into him, and we're told that mystery of the Trinity at that moment, let us make man in our image. And so we are created in this quote unquote our image, and so we're created with this relational capacity that is above all living creatures. And science affirms that, by the way. Sometimes we'll have a conversation about the neurology of Genesis chapter 1. It's fascinating because scientists and neurologists, they can measure the number of neurons in the prefrontal cortex, and the higher that they are, the higher that number is, the more tribal and relational that creature is. And so there are animals like dolphins and whales that tend to tribe together. Well, guess who's at the top of the food chain? We are. We have more neurons in our prefrontal cortex. Then they begin to measure the size of the brain compared to the size of the body. And again, it is evidence of the relationality in which we've been created. And so again, human beings are far above any other living creature. So we've just been engineered for it. So relationships, sometimes we look at the relationships, and of course when Jesus was asked, hey, what was the greatest commandment? And he says, well, basically to love God and to love others. And that's so at the core of the great commandments is this relational component. Having said that, it's not a should, like we should do that since Jesus, articulated these are the two highest things that we should be aiming for. But it's more than that. In other words, because we're engineered for it, because God has designed us for these deeper relationships, we will be unfulfilled as human beings until we have a deeper, intimate relationship with God, and that we have at least a small number of relationships with human beings at that deeper level. Here's why. Here in Florida, where I live, we have manatees. And manatee sightings are like, they're kind of like they give people a lot of jazz. Like, oh, there's a manatee, because you don't see them that often. And they just kind of tip above the water a little bit, and it's pretty neat experience. I think that's true for certain things in the Bible. And one of those things is this Trinitarian image, that it just kind of like, it's so profound and so mysterious, but it tips above at times. For example, at the baptism of Jesus, we get a snapshot of the Trinity where the Father is speaking of the Son, and then the Spirit of God falls down, and we're like, wow, that's such a beautiful picture. One of the pictures I always go to that surfaces is John chapter 1 verse 18, where John makes this statement, and he makes the same statement in one of his letters, his first letter. No man has ever seen God. That's the statement in John 1:18. And then he goes to say, no man has ever seen God except the only begotten, speaking of Jesus, who was in the bosom of the Father. Now we get just a glimpse of like, hey, they weren't just good friends. There is an intimate interweaving that is so mysterious with the Trinity. This is the image in which we've been created. Right. So now fast forward to the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus is praying for something that was broken in the Garden of Eden. It's from one garden to the next. What was broken in the garden was that when Adam and Eve sinned, the first thing they did was hide from God. So relationally, they were separated. In fact, they separated themselves. And now that we're downstream of Adam's fall, and that's infused in every human being, we are now master hiders. And so that's where the tension lies within most human beings. We crave a closer relationship with other people, and yet at the same time we've got this wall that Adam built up that we like to hide behind. So we want it, and yet we don't want it. And so when you look at social media, we promote our best side and we protect our worst side. And that's why Facebook and Instagram and company, they're all so popular, because it fits well without the civil war going within us. So at that moment, something was just desperately broken, and we still live with that. But then Christ came to restore all things. So in the Garden of Gethsemane, he's praying, Father, I pray that they will be one, just as you are in me and I am in you. There's John 1:18. Yes. He's saying, I'm praying for that oneness. Now, a lot of times when we look at that scripture, we think, he's just praying for, for us to come together and to have kind of a general sense of unity. But if that's the case, if we follow that thought through, then what he's saying is, I pray that they'll be generally, not throwing rocks at each other, and generally, unified, just like you and I, Father, are just kind of general unified. He's not saying that. Right. What he's saying is, I'm praying that they'll be restored to a place that in their lives, they can have some deeper, meaningful relationships. And I think it's really interesting that he goes on to say, I pray that they'll be one, Father, just as you are in me and I'm in you. And I pray that they will be in us. There's another picture of the Trinity. And so that the world will believe. So the world around us, they have plenty of stadiums. They have plenty of bars. They have plenty of activities. But it's not getting it for them, because what we're told is that some statistics that are quite alarming. In 2016, the United States Surgeon General said that the greatest risk to human health was not cancer, neither was it heart disease. It was isolation. It was loneliness. There are countries around the world, India, Great Britain, Japan, that now have official government positions called Minister of Loneliness. They're beginning to see this. And this movement, by the way, was all before COVID-19. When you look at the military veterans, suicide is going through the roof with these veterans. And it's because it's very difficult to come in from a war situation and not have anyone to talk to and have someone that can relate to you. So it's across the board, this sense of loneliness. I read one statistic that said 93% of American men have no best friend. I read an article recently that said 50% of all Americans have not formed a best friendship in the last 5 years. So in a way, technology has further isolated us. And I think it's why you see so much tension and a rise of road rage, and it's kind of bleeding out of our culture, because again we go back to our engineering. So when God created us this way, we must have it. God created us to breathe air, oxygen. God created us to drink water. We have to have that, and when we don't, things don't go well. So moving to the church culture. I referred to these circles, as you said, Larry, in terms of big circle, mid circle, and small circle. So most every church, been in many countries around the world, and I say, hey, show of hands, how many of you guys have a weekly worship service? 99% of the time. It doesn't matter if they're worshiping under a tree or in a hut or in a building. How many of you guys have groups of some kind, which is Bible studies or home groups or adult Sunday school, many different versions of that, but 99% of the hands go up. And I think that's true because this is what we've been taught. And sometimes when we look at the ministry of Jesus, we identify, because they're called disciples, we identify discipleship with the 12 disciples. But if you look a little deeper, obviously Jesus took out of that 12 Peter, James, and John. So he understood that, hey, we're going to have some close relationships. And so what the science tells us is that the way that we're designed and engineered is that we actually can have about 1,500 acquaintances, people that we know them. We may not remember their name, but that's about the capacity of it. Then we can have about 500 people that we can remember their name, and the number just keeps going down until it gets to about 5. We have the capacity to have no more than 5 intimately close relationships, and that's even a stretch for most people. And that if you're married, that includes your spouse or your boyfriend, girlfriend, who's your closest. But then beyond that, so now we put people in a group, and we hope that they'll have this kind of relationship. But in a group, for example, if you had 2 people, there's one unique relationship that's possible amongst 2 people. It's called a dyad, D-Y-A-D, a dyad. If you have 3 people, there are 3 dyads. If there are 3 possible relationships. But it's interesting what happens when you add a 4th person. Now it exponentially goes up. It's like compound interest. With 4 people in a group, there are now 6 possible relationships. So if you think of a diamond, a baseball diamond, all the bases are 4, but then you got to go from home plate to second base and first base to third base. And so all of a sudden you've got 6. So it's interesting when you do the math. With Jesus and his 12 disciples of 13 people, you now have 78 possible unique relationships in a group. We think, well, it's only 13 people. But if you everybody try to have a personal, intimate relationship with everybody in that group, it's 78. It's impossible. So this is where we come back to the statement. We just have to know the expectations of what can happen in a group. So what can happen in a group is that perhaps you may draw out from that mid-circle. You might have 1 or 2 more intimate, close relationships, but you can't have it with everybody in the group. And yet we try. So I think what's really interesting about the ministry of Jesus is that I make a proposal, and it's just a proposal. We have to let people's their own light bulbs come on and let God do what he can do from the inside out. But I make this proposal that when you look at the ministry of Jesus, at least there's not a lot of recorded life change that happens in the crowd scenes. You don't see, in fact, in John chapter 6, he says, hey, a lot of you guys are following me just for the fish and chips. You're getting a free meal, and that's drawing the crowd. But then when you look at the intersections that Jesus has with the individuals, like Zacchaeus, the woman at the well, Martha in the kitchen, hey, you're overloaded. Look at your sister. She's doing a better thing. Nicodemus, Thomas. I mean, it just goes on and on. My proposal is it there that we see the greatest life change happen? So Nicodemus is much different at the beginning of the story than he is at the end of the story. Zacchaeus, the original language says that Jesus descended on his home. Most likely he spent the night. And he went in and at least spent hours. It just wasn't a drive-through. He spent hours with Zacchaeus and probably having similar conversations as he did with the woman at the well. Like, Zacchaeus, why do you cheat? Tell me about your dad. Why was he a cheater? Where did you learn this from? What's your motivation? Jesus, as we see in the woman at the well, just begins to dig down. And here's, in my opinion, the secret sauce of those one-to-one conversations, and it's the word customization. Those conversations, unlike the crowd sermons that Jesus delivered, unlike the messages that he had in the group, those conversations with Zacchaeus and the woman at the well, Martha, they were customized to just that person. And this is often where we see the greatest life change, when you can say, hey, let's have a conversation about you, about your personal struggle. So when I came to Christ, and this is was the beginning of the germ of thought that kind of just kept going and broadening for me. When I came to Christ, I was in my 20s. I was studying to be a concert pianist, going to a music school in Boston. And I had searched for God for about 2 or 3 years and was really pressing in hard, and finally landed in a church. And it was a very multi-ethnic church. The pastor was from India, and there were a lot of people from the Caribbean islands. Just a wonderful, wonderful community. And I was sitting on the back row. The pastor's name was Titus. Again, he was from India, and he was just a strong preacher. Just was really clear with the gospel. Hey, anybody want to have God in their life? And again, I've been searching for 2 or 3 years, really reading through the Bible and trying to, make, connect the dots. And so my hand shot up. Man, I want God in my life. If you want God in your life, and if you raise your hand, then come on down front. I'm like, not happening. I didn't know, are they gonna make me say something, or who knows? So,
Sure.
On the way out of the church, Titus said, "Hey, I saw you raise your hand. Would you like to accept Christ into your life?" And being raw and not have given my life to Christ yet, I said, I don't even understand what that means, to accept Christ into my life. What does that mean? And he said, would you like to go back at a table for two in my office and talk about it? And I'm like, I really would. 3 hours later, on May 2nd, 1982, I gave my heart to Christ.
Amen.
Then what happened, and it was because of that conversation, I was not going to make that important of a decision for me. Other people do, but for me, I still had questions. I still had arguments. I still had, the big arguments of why bad things happen to good people and all those things that, come into our minds. Sure. But then what Titus did was, now I look back and I understand what he was doing. At the time I didn't. He said, I'm part-time pastor and I'm part-time landlord. And I'm the landlord of this apartment building that's right next to the church. And he said, I have an opening in one of my apartment flats. And in fact, you'd have a roommate, and the roommate is going to music school. So I think you guys would hit it off. And so I'm like, sure, because I lived in a rat hole in the inner city, and so it was kind of a no-brainer. So I moved into this place. I found out I was the only person in the entire apartment building that was not from India. And so that was pretty cool. I learned the culture right away, and I fell in love with curry and the food, and it was just wonderful. But here's the point of the story. Every Thursday night for a year and a half, Titus invited me up to his apartment flat to have dinner with he and his wife and his 2 small kids. And I say it like this: in a big city, I became part of a small family. And after every dinner on Thursday night, he would say, hey, Steve, you want to go spend some time together at a table for two? And I was I was full throttle when I became a Christian. I was one of those raw, non-diplomatic Christians, and, on fire and all that, rough edges. And so I joined, of course, with the music background, got involved in the big circle right away with the worship ministry. I went to every Bible study they offered, and I was just like a sponge. But something was different at the table for two, and the difference is in 2 layers. First, the content was customized, and that content, I wasn't going to raise my hand in a Bible study because in the church culture, it looks like everybody else got their act together. And so they seemed to have all the answers and know where to find Ezekiel in the Bible. And I didn't even know he existed. And so I could ask all those questions. But from a relational point of view, something happened around the 6-month mark, and it changed my entire perspective about church community and about relationships. About 6 months in, the relationship became safe. And in that safeness, I was able to share my struggles. James 5:16, confess your sins to one another. That's not happening for me in a group. It's still not happening for me in a group. More than 40 years later, the way I'm wired as an introvert, I'm still not going to put those things out in the midst of a group. In fact, some people are more comfortable with that, speaking out those things in a group. I'm always shocked, like, wow, I can't believe you just said that in a group. And so for me, it became healing. It became, I finally found the relationship, that relational dimension for which I had been created. So what was a shocker for me is when God changed my vocation and I moved from the pursuit of being a concert pianist and I went to seminary, there was nothing mentioned about disciple making, to be honest with you, and definitely nothing mentioned about this Paul, Timothy, David, John, Jesus, John type of relationship. And it was just surprising to me. I didn't know anything about the evangelical church culture, and it was just surprising to me because I thought, wow, that was so impactful and so meaningful. Why don't we do this more intentionally and put it as part of our strategies? Because I began to notice that every church had, a Yoda or two that could just go to a coffee shop, sit down with somebody, open the Bible, and just like talk life. And I always admired that. I'm like, wow. But what I also noticed is that most everyday people in our church, they weren't doing it. In fact, I would go so far as to say, I didn't see that model replicated when there was someone who was seasoned and, what I'm referring to as a Yoda, somebody that could do it easily. I didn't see that replicate because my observation is that if you're sitting there as an everyday person and someone just masterfully can do that, you almost begin to feel more inadequate, like, wow, I don't think I could ever do this. And so I just made the observation over a number of years, and so we planted the church that I'm the lead pastor in about 17 years ago. And we planted it as really an experiment. And to be honest, I wasn't trained to be a church planter and really kind of didn't want to. I was kind of pulling a Moses at the point, and I had been offered a job in a very large church here in our city. It would have been very easy for me to step into, but I couldn't get away from the call. I couldn't get away from this angst of what would it be like if we planted a church where one-to-one disciple making would be at the centerpiece and not just one of many programs. And so my wife and I, we prayed and we tried to pray out of it, and I just couldn't get away. So I found 6 other like-minded people, and we began in our living room. And from there, we began to find more people who really had the same passion. So I recognized very early, I was bivocational the first 6 years of our church, and I began to recognize that everyday people, they're not belligerent against or defiant against disciple making. It's just they don't know how. And so Ephesians chapter 4 is a directive towards leadership. Hey, we are to equip God's people for the work of the ministry. So I recognized that we needed to equip everyday people so that we can make it simple for people to make a disciple wherever their circle was. And so I set out to write these tools, and took about 6 years to write the tools. And the reason I wrote them, I had looked around some other tools, and I champion other tools. I think that it's wonderful. Anytime anybody talks about discipleship, man, I'm all down for that. But I was looking for some elements within the tools. Like, for example, how do we get beyond information transfer? How do we bring this alive a little bit? And how do we ensure that the disciple is going to become a disciple maker? What part of the tools is just the content, just more for them to learn about the Bible and learn about their relationship with God, but doesn't really train them to become a disciple maker? So these were some of the types of things that kind of catalyzed me to write the tools. So we wrote the tools, and we started with 3 disciple makers, and didn't even know, this was a whole experiment for us. And started with 3 disciple makers, and we met together, and I had them read through the first session. I wanted to make sure they they felt comfortable, and so they say, hey, let's talk about who you're going to choose. And some people would say, yeah, I'm going to choose Bob because Bob hadn't been to church in 3 months. I'm like, let's recalibrate that, because 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 2 says, hey, let's commit these things to faithful men, so that they're going to in turn become disciple makers themselves. So worked all through that, and we started. And I said, I want you to meet with your disciple in the next 2 weeks, and then we're going to reconvene, the four of us, me and 3 disciple makers, and let's just see how it goes. Guys, it was electric. When they came back, they were so excited about the conversations that they had that they suddenly saw these are conversations we're not having in a group, and we have different conversations in the group.
Right.
So we would say that the conversations at a table for two, at a one-to-one dynamic, can be both customized and the relationship can be confidential. And that's something that, in many ways, we're missing in the church culture, because there's so many things that we just want to talk about. The guy I'm discipling, for example, I got a text from him today. He has these 2 dogs that he just loves, and they're pretty young dogs, but he just loves them, and he's talking about it. And they just found out one of his dogs is going to die. He's got cancer, actually, and it seems simple, for a pet. We're talking about a pet, but it was meaningful to him, and he reached out and said, "Hey, can we talk?" We have sat in the back of his pickup truck and talked about parenting, because we both have teenagers, older teenagers that are about the same age range. We have had so many conversations and prayed for our teenagers, and just had this wonderful, confidential, customized relationship and I'm part of a men's group. I don't lead it intentionally. I've been part of the group for about 8 years. We have fun. We play pickleball. We play volleyball last Saturday, and then we have kind of a Bible study together. And I love my group, but I recognize that I cannot have the same expectations in the conversation, in the content, or the relationship that I can at that table for two. So I just say that they're both beautifully distinctive. And what we've seen is that God has just opened up this new dimension for us in the church culture. And from this point, it's just really, God has expanded in a lot of different places. So I know that's a long answer to what.
Man, that's a great answer, though. And I'm surprised Drew hasn't done a backflip right there in his studio, because you are right now talking this man's love language. Am I wrong, Drew? It is. Yeah. And I just want to tell our listeners, which, Steve, I don't know that I'd quite heard all of that before. So that was so cool for me. I knew a lot of the aspects and different. But that just shows in a more intimate setting right here. Made me think of that, and I loved your statement. And boy, it's worth repeating. Where one-on-one discipleship was the centerpiece, not a program.
Yeah.
And we do want to make everyone aware, there's a phone app that you can get. Yeah. If you'll go in your computer and put in small circle, and you'll see the red circle, you'll know it's that. And all of these discipleship materials are available to you. We're not going to, there's nothing to sell anyway. There's not a price, but we're not going to try to sell you on it. Go there and look and peruse. That's what I did when I first met Steve. I immediately got the app. And what I love, I want you to mention one aspect, because I know we're about to wrap up for time, but you always talk about, is it Soccer Mom Sally?
Yes.
Is that what you've called her?
Yes.
And I just want you to make one quick comment about that, because I want our listeners to understand. A good friend, mutual friend of ours, Heath Mitchell's teenage daughter, used Small Circle to disciple a young lady in school that she was in high school with. So if you're sitting there thinking you got to have a doctorate or you got to have been a Christian this long, no, you don't. So talk about Soccer Mom Sally for just a sec.
Yes, so our heartbeat is to make the tools accessible to everyday people, and as you said, Larry, there's no cost. God just kind of through just transitions and conversations and whatnot, we just 10 years ago we decided, hey, let's give this away. So you can go to smallcircle.com.
Yep.
You can find the link to the PDFs. You can find many languages, by the way. We're in about 50 languages. So you can download all those for free. You can download a printer's, like a professional printer's version with crop marks, so you can print them yourself and wherever you live. And of course, you can get the link actually right there on smallcircle.com to go to the mobile app. One of the things that I think is important for us to realize is that Jesus chose ordinary people. We knew that, right? In Acts chapter 4, people were shocked that they were, quote unquote, uneducated. They had been educated by Jesus, but they, didn't have that formal education. And I think that, I think this is a reality. Without everyday people, we can never experience a cultural change or a movement. You think about revolutions across history. Everyday people are the drivers, right? And so a lot of times when it comes to disciple making, we think it's just, I talk to pastors and they might be doing it, but then it's not happening in everyday people. And I would say that's where the jazz is, when you see everyday people discipling others who then disciple others who then disciple others. We're in our 7th generation in our local church, and so it's exciting. The thing about Soccer Mom Sally is here's the way I look at it. We sometimes, I think as a church, inadvertently put more stress on everyday people than we realize we're doing. What I mean by that, let's say Soccer Mom Sally's a single mom. She's got 2 kids. One's in middle school, one's in elementary school. Soccer Mom Sally, she wakes up early in the morning to get the kids' lunch ready. She's getting them up and dragging them out of bed like we all do as parents, getting them, ready to go to the bus stop or dropping them off at school. Then Sally goes to work. She's got her kids in an after-school program. Sally's going to get off around 5 o'clock and then go pick up her kids. By the time she goes through traffic, it's about 5:45, 6 o'clock. It's time for Sally to make dinner now. And now she's making dinner. The kids hopefully are doing their homework, but they got to have a little help from Mom. And then after that, it's bath time and bedtime and Bible time, and it's 9 o'clock. And you know what Sally's going to do the next day? She's going to rinse and repeat. She's going to do the same thing over and over. She's pretty darn tired. Now, we're asking Sally to be consistent and faithful on Sunday morning. We're, in fact, asking her to volunteer somewhere on Sunday morning. We're asking her to be in a group or a Bible study. We're asking her to have friends that don't yet know Christ and to build relationships. And we just keep building and building and throwing things on Sally's plate. And then we're going to try to fit disciple making in. And so for our church, and I say this is not a prescription, but we have had a number of churches regroup and rethink how they structure themselves. If you're serious about having disciple making at a one-to-one level, at the centerpiece of your church culture, something has to move. If you're trying to fit it in, especially if you find yourself with a lot of layers of programming, which always demands volunteers, you may have to rethink, and I know that's super difficult. I did a revitalization of a church for a number of years, and I know how hard it is to change things, so I get that. So I say it sensitively, but when we planted the church, we had the luxury of saying, hey, let's start a new DNA. So what we did is that we put our groups every other week and not every week. And so on 1 week, the first week of the month, for example, all of our church, we have groups. So we've got about 35 groups in our church right now. So they meet on that week. On the next week, we have no allowance for groups. It's we call them empty parking spaces. And those empty parking spaces are for Soccer Mom Sally's and truck driver Teds. They're for the folks that are out there working a full job, and we're allowing them during that week to have time to do one-to-one disciple making. So it has, for us, again, being sensitive, that's not for everybody, but for us and for other churches I've noticed that went to that model, it has been a wonderful rhythm that allows disciple making to be seriously at the centerpiece of the culture.
Drew, I'm just curious. You don't know anything about changing DNA and revitalization, do you, buddy?
Well, we're learning. I can just tell you that. I don't know that we know a whole lot about it other than we've tried a few things. But what I love about what you're saying, Steve, is try some things and put at the heart of who you are and what you do, making disciples, making it one-on-one, making it accessible, and also just an awareness of where our people are. Sometimes as pastors and leaders, I think we just go, just do it, just deal with it. This is church. And if you don't deal with it, you're bad, or you're not serious about Jesus or something. And so there's an awareness of where people are at and trying to equip them for the work of ministry and then giving them the space to go do it. And that's what I love. We're doing the very similar thing that you just mentioned, the kind of one-on, one-off. We actually, in our service, we have a service one week, and then we'll do groups the next week, and then we'll have a service the next week. And so it's something where we're beginning this, and it's difficult to get going because of our tradition and what we're used to. But our hope is that we can send people out to be on ministry, on mission with other people, and give them the space to do it. So I love what you're saying. I'm championing everything you're saying here. So it's wonderful.
Yeah, I would speak to pastors for a minute, Drew and Larry, and just say, when we first started this and had this concept, I was, to be honest with you, a little hesitant, because I thought, it's like sending the 72 out. Like, hey, what's going to happen, man? They're out there, right? And all that angst and worry was worthless, because what we've seen is it becomes very, very exciting to see the people in our churches get involved at a level where they're pouring out their lives. So we would celebrate if somebody joins a group, but for the most part, they're interacting a little bit. They're receiving probably more than they're giving. That's true for our Sunday morning worships or worship services when they are, but they're receiving more than they're giving. But when it comes to a table for two, what we've noticed is the electricity goes up, the jazz goes up, because you've got people that are like, I feel like I'm in the game. I'm pouring my life out to somebody else. And so I would just say to pastors, hey, it's a way that we have seen life being breathed into the church. Unfortunately, we think if we change the style and wear skinny jeans, that's going to breathe, some kind of excitement into the church these days. And but it's about relationships, and it's about people. And once they can pour it out, man, it starts to rise.
Great word. And I just love a guy that can use the word jazz like you do. If I use that word, people look at me and go, what? But I love it. What a great word for that, where the jazz, the electric goes up. Yeah. Man, Steve, thanks for joining us today. And I know Drew's going to kind of wrap it up and put a bow on it. But, hey, those of you out there listening, I love what Steve and Drew are both saying. Do something, try something on this one-on-one, but nothing in here was the prescription.
That's right.
Figure it out, and we'll help any way we can. So, Drew, I'll kick it over to you, bud.
Well, I just want to say a big thank you, Steve, for being with us today. We're so thankful for your ministry and how God has led you and your team to build Small Circle. And I love one of the things that from the first time I saw it that I thought was so inventive and wonderful was the aspect of having it right on your phone. We live with our phones everywhere, and the fact that you can connect to those Bible studies and to those people, and it's just a wonderful tool and app. And so we want to encourage you who are listening, men, women, students, whatever, smallcircle.com, go on your phone's app browser and pick that up and begin to get intentional with a few people where you're making disciples. That is the heart of Steve, I believe, and the heart of this program, and should be the heart of the church. It's what Jesus called us to. So thank you for joining us today. Steve, again, thank you. Larry, I hope this has been a blessing to you. And if we can help you in any way, please let us know. info@healthychurchpodcast.com. We want to help you, pray for you, or any suggestions or ideas that you have. We would love to hear those as well. Thank you. God bless you. And we'll talk to you next time on the Healthy Church Podcast.
For more information and other resources, go to healthychurchpodcast.com.